海暮れて鴨の声ほのかに白し
The waters fade, and the wild duck's cries are faintly white. What a beautiful message, written by Matsuo Basho in the 17th century. This original Japanese poem captures a sound in nature and delivers a message. Remarkably, it does so in 3 short lines. This is the mystery of the haiku. Welcome to the beauty of haiku poetry. Today, we're going to discover one of Japan's most popular art forms. The art of haiku, as we know it, has a very long history. It is the descendant of the hakai, a longer linked verse in Japanese literature. Dating back to the 12th century, the hakai verse begins with a 3-line hokku, or introductory poem. The hokku sets the tone for the hakai with essential information like the season, the time of day, or landscape characteristics. The strength and privileged position of the haiku eventually led to its independent composition. In the 17th century, the hokku master Matsuo Basho refined this art of brief conscious expression, saying so much with so few words. The art form spread with the help of later masters Yosa Buson and Kobayashi Isa in the 18th and 19th century. In the late 19th century, the 4th and last great hokku master, Masaoka Shiki, modernized the name of the art form, blending the terms hakai and hokku. Thus, we know this ancient poetic form as haiku. Haiku follows a specific structure. The traditional haiku poem contains 17 onji, or Japanese syllables, divided into 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7, and the third concludes with 5. Of course, when we translate original Japanese haiku into English, it is nearly impossible to preserve this structure.
We tend to think of a haiku as an isolated little poem. In Japan, they're usually part of a bigger context, either with a prose introduction or as part of a series of haiku that lead one to the next. And so the meaning of the haiku is enlarged by the context it appears in Japan. They're not thought of in Japan as these isolated little nuggets the way we tend to think of them. So that's one big problem, I think, when Americans are trying to write haiku. They think of them in isolation with no context around them. Another big problem is that the haiku are part of a tradition of Japanese poetry that goes back more than 1,000 years. There was never an interruption in this tradition in Japan. That is, there was in the West, in Europe, you have a Middle Age that interrupted the flow of knowledge, and then a Renaissance to bring it back. In Japan, there was no such break and no Renaissance because there was no need for a Renaissance. The tradition was continuous, and haiku is part of that tradition.
However, composers of English haiku strive to maintain the traditional structure, allowing only slight variations when necessary. Basho defined the theme of the traditional haiku through the practice of observing nature and recording his observations in the simplest terms. Season words, or kigo, describe weather features, flowers, fruits, animals, and customs that imply a specific time of year. Cherry blossoms signify spring, snow indicates winter, and mosquitoes suggest summer. Some season words are not as obvious. In Japan, the moon, rain, and frogs represent specific times of the year. The reader must learn to interpret these cultural references when reading original Japanese haiku. For example, the moon generally represents the harvest moon in mid-September.
There's a tradition in Japanese literature, and particularly in poetry, that the boundary lines between the natural world and human activities are blurred. And a poet isn't necessarily writing about nature specifically or human activity specifically. He's sort of writing about both simultaneously.
Let's look at the seasonal theme in this haiku from the modern master Shiki. A mountain village, deep in snow, under the drifts, a sound of water. Seasonal references anchor the setting or the time and place. In this case, it is winter in a mountain village. A specific event creates color and mood. The sound of water introduces movement to the frozen landscape. The melting ice turns a chilly winter setting into a bright, shiny early spring thaw. The imagery in haiku appeals to the senses. We see the mountain village and hearing the trickling sound of water. Some haiku use the smell of blossoms or the feel of tall grass on our hands as we walk. Seasonal emphasis reflects a change in the natural world which parallels our human world. Observing these changes creates an emotional response in the reader, be it joy, sadness, or a bittersweet mixture. The first two lines of this haiku give us a visual image of a small community covered in snowdrifts. But in the third line, we discover so much more. The trickling sound of water under snowdrifts changes the image to one of spring thaw. The two images resonate with each other to create a mood, atmosphere, or impression. The link between the images is not specified. The reader makes the tie and steps inside the haiku. With the trickling sound of water, the snow-covered mountain village becomes warmer. The bright sunshine is heating the earth and melting the snow from beneath. This change is produced through another structural characteristic of haiku, its method of presentation.
Traditionally, haiku were chanted or sung, and I've never heard a performance of haiku being recited that way in Japanese. I've heard readings of English haiku that were just like any other poetry reading, and I didn't find them particularly interesting. But what I like is to see haiku written in beautiful calligraphy, preferably in the artist's or in the poet's own handwriting, because in China and Japan both calligraphy, painting, and poetry are all sort of a continuum of art. All of the great poets were also calligraphers, and some of them were also painters. And they would make a painting and then write their own poem in their own calligraphy right on the painting. That was a common combination.
Here's a poem by the classic haiku master, Issa. The aged dog seems impressed with the song of the earthworms. The first line presents the character. Characters are found in nature. Animals, insects, even the petals of a flower can be the subject or character of a haiku. The second line paints a picture of an old dog listening attentively, which creates happiness. Then the third line brings about a new, stronger emotion. We see the dog reacting to the nature around him. The reader interprets the last line in a personal way. One reader may suddenly see the old dog staring at the ground, his head cocked to one side with the renewed curiosity of a puppy. Another may envision the old dog lying on the ground with his ears perked up, and still another may see the dog pausing in the middle of a vigorous dig to hear the rumbling earthworms. Poets carefully construct their haiku to bring to mind a moment of realization. To do this, they establish the subject in the first or second lines. The answer or the element that ties the parts together appears in the third line. The effect is a surprise to the reader. Thus, the haiku is broken up into two parts. Japanese poetry uses neither capital letters nor punctuation. So in Japanese, the division is brought about by kureji, or cutting word. English writers must rely on various punctuation marks for these distinct pauses.
In most haiku, there's a break either after the first line or after the second line. Sometimes it's after, in fact, I think more often it's after the first line. I have an example here. How still it is here, dash, in this translation. Stinging into the stones, the locusts trill. So that breaks into the first line, pause, and the next two lines.
Unlike structured English forms, haiku poems follow no sentence structure or rhyming sequence. As we saw with the previous examples, Words and phrases are sufficient to describe the observation. Although modern poets have broadened the themes of haiku poetry, traditional haiku describe nature or a season. Japanese culture recognizes the changing of seasons in everyday life. Haiku poetry is simple and honest. While some works rely on wordplay, such as the pun, alliteration, and onomatopoeia, haiku poetry does not employ metaphors or similes. The main task of the poem, according to Basho, is to represent reality without the contamination of the poet's ego. A simple style is preferred so that the focus of the poem is on the subject itself. Though haiku does not use metaphor, it may suggest metaphorical powers through its concrete observations. Also, it is not good practice to have one image be the cause and the following image be the effect. The two halves should be of equal status and complement each other in subtle ways, not obvious ones.
They picked up on word associations, words that resonated with other poems that they had already heard, or place names that they already knew or had even visited, so that the poems are full of echoes and resonances that the original audience picked up on immediately, that American audiences don't, because Americans haven't been to Matsushima and the other famous places in Japan. Those place names don't ring any bells for them.
Many haiku poems contain aesthetic qualities called sabi and wabi. Sabi refers to things that show marks of aging, like an old pond or a gnarled tree. Here is an example by Kobayashi Isa. Full moon, my ramshackle hut is what it is. The descriptive word ramshackle provides the sabi element. Wabi refers to simplicity or poverty. It is realized most fully in the tea ceremony with simple objects, the kettle, the bowl, and the taste of the tea. This allows for harmony, respect, and the quiet mind to be present. Here is an example by Yosa Busan. Tea flowers, are they white, yellow? This observation focuses on the simple, delicate tea flowers and their distinctly light shade. Together, sabi and wabi represent qualities that are much appreciated in Japan, like the appreciation of the simple, unpretentious, and neglected, rather than the glamorous, new, and shiny.
There's a common proverb in Japanese, deru kugi wa utareru, which means the nail that sticks out will get hammered down. The idea there, I think what that means is, or what's behind that is an emphasis on social harmony. You don't want to stick out too much. You want to be part of the group. You don't want to be too conspicuous, too flashy. You don't want to attract too much attention to yourself. And using a flashy image or an image that's totally original that nobody has ever used before would be immodest. It would be attracting attention to yourself, and it would probably draw criticism.
Here is one of Matsuo Basho's haiku poems translated from Japanese. What voice, what song, spider, in the autumn wind? These images of haiku are usually modest, not chosen for their beauty, but experienced and recorded. It was Basho who said, "Things are as they are when haiku happens." These images in haiku are important.
The tradition of Japanese poetry that haiku is a part of evolved out of a court poetry that demanded a very high level of decorum and politeness and deliberately avoided shocking images. Since these were poems that often were read in front of the emperor, not haiku, but the earlier poems that the haiku tradition evolved out of. These were poems that were recited in front of the emperor, and so it didn't do to have loud, flashy images and inelegant images. One of the characteristics of early Japanese poetry is that it's very subdued, elegant, graceful, and that's because it's a court poetry. As for the humble subjects, I think this again is probably related to Buddhism and to the idea that the Buddha nature can be found in anything, certainly any living thing, whether it's a flea or a lice or a human being, and also the Buddhist idea that human beings are part of a larger context. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The Buddha nature is in everything, even the most humble things. Also the idea that enlightenment, which is the objective of Buddhism, of course, enlightenment can come from the most humble sort of activities. Raking the grass, for example, is seen by Zen Buddhists as a form of meditation. So the most humble activities, the most humble images partake of the truth of Buddhism. I think that's behind some of the very humble images and everyday images in haiku.
In Japan, the haiku is still the most popular poetic form. Thousands of poets in Japan submit their works to regularly published columns. Competitions inspire writers to observe their natural surroundings and create. The haiku is a timeless, precise construct, and in the end, it can open up worlds and bridge generations, languages, and cultures. I hope you have enjoyed our venture into haiku poetry, and I hope you observe the world and create haiku for yourself. Sayonara.